I'm going to show you how to call a workflow with inputs through the Orchestrator REST API. Let's get started. Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. In the previous video, we ran a workflow that had no inputs. In this video, we're going to run workflows that have one or more inputs. Let's go do that in the lab environment. As you'll recall, in the previous video, we ran the workflow called Hello World. In the first part of this video, we're going to run this workflow called Hello First Name. Let's take a look at the workflow. As you can see, we can view the workflow ID. This particular workflow's workflow ID ends in 2 Charlie Alpha 7. Why don't we just briefly commit that to memory? Then let's go look at the Inputs tab. This workflow has one input called First Name. First name is of type string, and as I'm sure you've already guessed, the point of this input is to ask the user to specify their first name so that instead of saying hello world, this workflow will say something such as hello Brian. So we have this one input called first name, and if we go look at the schema, the way this works is very similar to the last workflow, but notice when we look at the scriptable task and we look at its inputs, this time there is a single input. We are doing an inward binding to the input called first name. In the scripting tab, as you can see, we're once again doing a system.log, but this time instead of saying hello world, we're saying hello followed by their first name and finishing up with an exciting exclamation point. So again, this is a very simple workflow. Let's see if we can go run it in Postman. So we switch over to Postman, and here in Postman, as you can see, I'm looking at our REST request called run workflow. But if you look closely here at the workflow underscore ID variable, notice this one ends in 22 Charlie 2. That's the workflow ID for the hello world workflow. We need to insert into this variable the workflow ID of the new workflow, which we could do either by copy and pasting, or I'm going to do it by going to Environments, VVork. This is where I'm defining all my Postman variables. And instead of setting workflow name to hello world, we'll set it to hello first name. Remember to save. Then if we go to our REST request called get workflow ID by workflow name, we should be able to run that. So let's go ahead and send this request. And if this all worked correctly, when we go back to run workflow and look at that variable, notice that that variable now ends in 2 Charlie Alpha 7, which is the workflow ID of the workflow called hello first name. So we've got the right workflow ID in our workflow underscore name variable. So in theory, we should be able to click the send button to send this request. See if you can figure out what's not right here, given that we're trying to call a workflow that has an input. Again, hit pause if you'd like to think about that. Well, if you take a look at the body tab, you can see that the body that we've defined here is the same one we used previously. This body was perfect if the workflow didn't have any inputs, but this workflow does. Now, ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to change this body to pass in that one input, and it's going to look like this. But before we run this request with the correct input defined in the body, what I'd like to do is go back to what we just had. Now I've set the body back to the way it was because I want to show you what happens if you run this request, but you're failing to pass in the inputs. So let's go ahead and click send. And as you know, we always immediately check the status code, and interestingly enough, this one says 202. The Orchestrator server accepted this request, even though this request body lacks the input that the workflow wants us to send. So what's going on here? Well, there's a number of things going on here, but the key thing to get into your brain right from the beginning is that it is your responsibility as the client to do the right thing. I'm going to show you in the next few steps exactly how to do that, but the responsibility is on you, the person that is writing or running the client program. So this failed because we didn't pass in the information that we're supposed to pass in. So how could we force it to require that input? Well, over in Orchestrator, there is a mechanism that you can get to by going through the Input Form tab. So here we are in the Hello First Name workflow. Let's go to the Input Form tab and see what's going on in here. Each of the items that you see here in the canvas, in this case there's only one, but each of these items represents an input. By default, when we run this workflow, a window pops up and it prompts us to enter the first name, but it doesn't have this nice easy label that we see here. Instead, the default behavior in Orchestrator is when it pops up the window to ask you the input is labeled with the name of the input. So instead of being nice and saying to the user running our workflow, what is your first name? It instead would just say first name, capital F-I-R-S-T, capital N-A-M-E, which looks weird to the user. So the input form lets us do a lot of different things. One of which is you can change the label of each of these inputs to something more readily understood by the user. Again, I have already changed this so that instead of saying first name, it says, what is your first name? So through the input form, you can change the label. You can specify a nice, easy to understand label. You can hide the input if you don't want the user to see it. Perhaps you want to hard code the value and you don't even want them to see the value of the input. You can show the value of the input that you've predefined, but make it read only so the user can't change it. And these are just some of the things that you can do on the Appearance tab. As you can see, we also have a Values tab, and what I really want to show you is this Constraints tab. The Constraints tab lets you specify whether or not this input is required. And right now, notice that it says, no, this input is not required. So let's change this to say yes. That input is now required according to what it says here in the input form. Again, we can do other things. For example, you can say what the minimum length and the maximum length are of the name that the user is typing in, and a bunch of other things. But the key thing I want you to see here is I have set this input to be required. Now, of course, I need to remember to save this. So let's go ahead and save. And just before we go run this, I want to introduce another term real quickly here, which is the concept of input presentation. So we go into this thing called the input form. We design how we want this to work, and that's described through something called input presentation. If you'd like to, you can think of the terms input form and input presentation interchangeably. But here in the Orchestrator client, they talk about the input form. Over in the API, it talks about the input presentation. Speaking of which, why don't we go back over to the Postman client real quickly here. And as you know, I have a bunch of different collections and REST requests here, including, I want to briefly go back to this request that we've seen before called get one workflow. Notice because of the value in workflow underscore ID, when I run this, it's going to get information about just the workflow called hello first name. So let's go ahead and run this request. You've actually already seen this previously, but I would like to show you something that you saw before. You saw before that when you get information on a single workflow, it gives you all these different URLs. These are actually endpoint URLs that you can use in the next REST request that you send. But what I want you to see here crucially is that, there we go, on lines 14 through 16, it's defining a URL that you can go to if the client wants to see the input presentation. In other words, a well-behaved REST client will go to this presentation URL to find out all the settings we just set up on the input form. And a well-behaving client will use that input presentation information so that the client behaves the way the input form says to behave. So this client will when you write it, will enforce that the user supply that mandatory value for first name. And by reading the input presentation, if we said that the input has to be somewhere between 1 and 10 characters, it's the responsibility of the client to check that. With this in mind, let's go back to the run workflow REST request. We're going to leave the body set incorrectly here, and we're going to send this request again, thereby launching the workflow again. So let's do that in 3, 2, 1. That was unexpected. It still says 202. The orchestrator server accepted the request. And in fact, the orchestrator server is actually running that new workflow, the hello first name workflow. In fact, we can confirm that. If my count is right, we've actually run it twice now. If we go over to workflow runs, you'll notice that the hello first name has, in fact, run twice. But if you look at either of these workflow runs and look at the logs tab, in both cases, it says hello nothing, because it still is not receiving the value of the input called first name. Now at this point, you're probably asking yourself, why did the client, let's go back to the REST client, why here in Postman, the REST client, why did we get a 200? Why did the orchestrator server not send back something like a 404? I can't find 404 or some error status code. Well, the answer has to do with what I said before, which is that it's your responsibility in the REST client to make certain that you're doing the right thing according to the input presentation. The input presentation says that first name, the input first name, is required, and therefore your client should have code in it to detect that this input first name is still not being supplied. Again, it is the responsibility of the client to make certain that it's doing the right thing according to what the input presentation says. Now, what we've seen here is that the orchestrator server is willing to accept your malformed REST request here because, again, the orchestrator server is assuming that the client's going to do the right thing. So again, write code in your client to not only look at the input presentation, but follow the presentation. Here is an example of a request body that is sending one input. So notice it's again in JSON format. Name specifies the name of the input that we're passing in. We're going to set the scope to local for now. The type is indicating what sort of data that we're passing in. And then lines 8 through about here are defining the value that we're assigning to that input. So the input called first name has the string called Brian. Let's hit send. Workflow, the REST request gets sent. The workflow is running. We get back a 202. And if, again, we want to prove this to ourselves, if we go back over to activity workflow runs, we can see that it ran a third time. And if we look at the third most recent workflow run and look at its logs tab, you'll notice that this is now functioning the way we want it. It says hello, comma, Brian, exclamation point. That's the behavior that we wanted all along. So forgive me for all the lead in up until this. This is what we are striving for, but it's really important that you understand that there are responsibilities on your shoulders as the person running or writing the REST client. All right, I think I've hammered that point home quite far enough. So let's go back to Postman and talk about what we're going to do next. What we're going to do next is run a third workflow called hello full name. We'll see what that one's going to do over here in Orchestrator. So over in Orchestrator, in the Orchestrator client, let's go look at our workflows. Let's search for the word hello. Here is a workflow called hello full name. Let's study what it is defined to do. So here in hello full name, again, just memorizing the last 4 digits or so. This one ends in Delta 4 Echo 0. So we know the workflow ID, and we're going to have to plug that workflow ID into our Postman variable called workflow_name. But let's look at how this workflow is designed. It has 2 inputs, one called first name, which we saw in the previous workflow, and a new input called last name. Both of those are strings. If we go over to the schema, our scriptable task has some inward bindings, one to each of those inputs. So we have an inward binding to first name and an inward binding to last name. And if we go over and look at the code, it's essentially the same code, but this time we're not just going to pin the first name, we're also going to pin the last name. So this should result in a logging message that says something like, hello, Brian Watrous, ! But the key thing to understand about this workflow is it has 2 inputs. So what do we need to do over in Postman? Well, let's go over to Postman and find out. One of the things that we need to do, since we're running a different workflow, we need to go back to our Postman variables. We need to change the name. This time it's going to be hello full name. Don't forget to save. So we save that variable. Then if we go over to get workflow ID by workflow name and send that request, now our run workflow REST request is ready to run. But our body, our request body, only has 1 input. Now you know, because I went into this in nauseating detail, that it's your responsibility to look at the input presentation and discover, oh, there's multiple inputs, what types they're expecting, whether they're required or not. So that's all on you. But we're going to do this just through Postman. You might want to hit pause and quiz yourself, but what do you think this body needs to be changed to look like? Again, right now, it's just handling a single input, but hit pause and think about what this would look like for 2 inputs. When you've done that, unpause and we'll talk about it. All right, welcome back. I'm going to get rid of that body, and I'm going to replace it with this body. And I'll resize here so that we can see the whole thing. So as I'm sure you can already figure out, the parameters array has, in this case, 1 input called first name, value Brian, and it has a second input called last name with the value of Watrous. Now, if you are actually going through this and doing this on your own, do make certain that you remember to put the comma here between these 2 elements of the array. Previously, when we only had 1 input, we didn't need that comma because there was nothing after that comma. This was the last lines 4 through 15 were the last and only element, but crucially the last element of the array. But now since we have multiple elements in the array, we need to make certain that we add this comma. Again, forgive me for belaboring the point, but missing that comma will cause this to fail. So I've included the comma. I'm going to hit send. And as always, I'll check to see the status code that I get back. And since I got a good status code, I could go look at the workflow token ID and what state it was in when it started running. And crucially, for our purposes right now, I can see in lines 9 through 30, I can see the 2 inputs that got passed in. And not just what their names are, but also what their values are. I still don't have any outputs. I still don't have any variables, also known as attributes, but we'll talk about those in a video coming up. Now, let's prove that this is working. Let's go over to Orchestrator. In Orchestrator, let's close out of the workflow. We'll go to Activity Workflow Runs, and notice that we have a new workflow run for the Hello Full Name workflow. And when we open up that workflow run and go to the Logs tab, notice that we are logging hello, Brian Watrous, ! Give yourself a pat on the back because you now know how to call an Orchestrator workflow through the Orchestrator REST API, but a workflow that has 1 or more inputs. In the next video, we're going to complicate this a bit further by passing in different types of inputs. And these examples in this video, we only looked at passing in strings, but there are other data types such as number and Boolean. Those are simple data types. We'll also show you how to learn to pass in complex input such as a VC virtual machine, if you know what that is. So lots of good stuff in store in the next video. Join me in the next video as we continue to explore the Orchestrator REST API.